Something very unusual happened in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, something that gave birth to the largest spiritual movement the world has ever seen. The central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead. His tomb was empty, and his followers encountered him alive again after his death. But can we really know what happened 2,000 years ago?
Well, it's interesting, again, lots of the postmodern theorists, the people coming along questioning whether we can really know anything at all, would use that same argument for things that happened 50 or 60 years ago. Can we know anything in history at all? This is a debate that we hear in our classrooms today. It's fascinating to me that General Eisenhower, when shortly after the end of the Second World War, he went to visit the Buchenwald concentration camp, and he saw what had happened during the Holocaust. He saw with his own eyes the horror of what had happened in that death camp, and he wrote in his diary that evening that he wanted to write an account of what he had seen, lest it should ever be said that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda. In other words, Eisenhower, writing about the Second World War, predicted that people would come along and say, this was propaganda, we can't really be sure whether the Nazis did this or not. Isn't that exactly what's happened with revisionism? There is a historical movement saying we can't be sure about the Holocaust, did it really happen? Raising questions about it.
I would say if we're going to study ancient history, we need to abide by the rules of history, i.e., wherever possible, we need to look for eyewitness data. We need to look to closeness to the facts. We have to look to some of what's called criteria. Why would we accept this fact over this fact? How do we adjudicate between issues? I think we believe we can do ancient history because, like I said, we don't step in and say there's no Julius Caesar, or the mists of time keep us from knowing who Alexander the Great is.
So I would say the question isn't about how long ago did these things happen in history. The question is, can we have access to history at all? And I would argue, yes, we can. We don't just take one person's word for a historical event. We come at history via converging lines of evidence, different kinds of evidence, written evidence, pictorial evidence, inferential evidence. That means evidence that we can infer from other things like statistical data. And I would strongly argue we can come at the resurrection of Jesus along those sort of lines.
I'm basically an ancient historian. My oldest son is a modern historian, and I sometimes tease him that it's so hard for him because there's so much evidence. He studies 19th century France, and there are millions of pamphlets and newspapers and archives and documents. You will never get to the bottom of it. And I study first century Greco-Roman world with Judaism in particular, and there's not nearly as much evidence. If I had nothing else to do, I could probably sit down and read through all the first century evidence from Greece and Rome and Palestine and Israel and so on in perhaps a year or so. I might have to give up golf and a few other things, but could be done. And so inevitably with ancient history, there are lots of gaps, and that's simply par for the course. There are many years where we really don't know what was going on very much anywhere in the ancient world. But at certain other points, we have a bright light shed on certain key elements. In the first century BC, we get that not least because a well-known Roman lawyer and politician called Cicero wrote a lot of letters to friends which have survived, giving a very sharp, clear picture of what Roman society was like, what was going on, who was in, who was out, and all of that. And then a century later, we have another Roman called Seneca, who also wrote a lot of letters and pamphlets and books and so on. And we can see quite a lot about what the Roman world of his day was like. In between the two of them, though much closer to Seneca than Cicero, we have Paul writing his letters, which again give us a very sharp, clear, focused spotlight on what earliest Christianity was all about. And then we have these extraordinary documents we call the Gospels, which, as colleagues of mine have argued, go back to very early eyewitness testimony, where we really do know a very great deal, not about everything that happened in the first 30 years of the first century, but about the public career of Jesus of Nazareth, and particularly about the events concerning his death and what happened immediately afterwards. So though, yes, a lot of ancient history is lost in the mist of time, there's plenty of ancient history which we do have very sharp, clear focus on, and Jesus and Paul sit right in the middle of that.
And yet the sources for Alexander, to pick that example, or the sources for Tiberius Caesar, are way worse than the sources for Jesus. We not only have New Testament sources, and a lot of people kind of raise their eyebrows, but skeptics, not skeptics who say anything, but skeptics who are trained scholars, they will go to the New Testament as quickly as believers will. Now, where they go may be different, but they will go to the New Testament just as quickly as Christians would, and they would never stop. I'm talking about skeptical scholars. They would never stop and say, you can't use that data. But we also have 12.5 sources for Jesus within about 100, 150 years after the life of Jesus, and every one of those is non-Christian. Plus we have some archaeological sources, plus we have some Christian sources that are outside the New Testament. You put all of this body of data together, and it's an incredible amount of information.
People will often say, how can you know anything about an event that happened 2,000 years ago? And I think when they say this, they fail to understand that the crucial time gap is not between the time of the event and today. The crucial time gap is between the time of the event and the evidence for the event. If the gap between the event itself and the evidence for the event is narrow or short, then it doesn't matter how long the evidence and the event have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the passage of time. So it's really irrelevant how long ago this occurred. What's critical is the gap between the evidence and the event that the evidence is about. And in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, speaking in terms of ancient history, that event is, or that gap is remarkably short. The evidence for the event comes within the first generation after the event itself by persons who were companions of Jesus or who knew companions of Jesus, so that we're in a very good position, I think, to establish what actually happened.
Some people question the reliability of ancient history, and their general response is something like, 2,000 years ago is a long time. Now, interestingly enough, they don't say that when they're watching a documentary on Alexander the Great. They don't say that when they're talking about Tiberius Caesar, who's on the throne of the Roman Empire when Jesus died, and he lived just a few years longer than Jesus. They take it at face value. They generally say things like that when they can't figure it out, or if you want to talk about religious history and they don't like religion. In other words, there's a little bit of unevenness of the application.
When we look at the past to see what occurred, we look for multiple sources, multiple independent sources, eyewitness sources, early sources, embarrassing reports, and things like this. When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, we have as much data, if not more, in support of the historicity of Jesus' resurrection as we have for Julius Caesar's crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC. The difference and the main objection here isn't a lack of historical data. It's a matter of worldview, because the resurrection of Jesus requires a supernatural being.
Historians have good standards for knowing about history. Early testimony, independent sources, and so on. By these standards, the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is very good. So why are people skeptical? Not because of lack of evidence, but because the event itself is supernatural. But this is a question of worldview, not of facts. If someone's worldview leads them to reject Jesus rising from the dead, they'll always look for an alternative explanation, for the evidence. In the next few programs, we'll look at some of the alternatives that have been put forward. Next time, we'll look at whether the accounts of Jesus rising from the dead were legends added on hundreds of years after he lived.